Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we begin with a locked door. Imagine it, you are standing outside the city walls of Burgos, the capital of Castile, and the gates will not open for you. Not because the guards forgot to lift the latch, not because there was some mix-up at the front desk of medieval bureaucracy. The gates are shut because the king himself has ordered every soul inside to refuse you shelter, refuse you food, refuse you so much as a cup of water. Anyone who helps you faces the seizure of their home, their land, everything they have ever owned. You are not a criminal. You are not a traitor in any way that would hold up in a modern court. You are Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, the finest warrior in all of Iberia, and you have just been exiled by the man you spent your entire life serving. You probably won't survive the next 40 days. But that is exactly why this story is worth telling. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are at it, drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what the local time is. Knowing that someone in, say, Melbourne or Montreal is settling in for this journey alongside you makes the whole thing feel a little warmer. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1074 by the old reckoning, and the decree has already been signed. You have 9 days, some accounts say fewer, to cross the border of Castile, or face consequences that the royal document does not bother spelling out in polite terms. The message is clear enough without the footnotes. You are no longer welcome in the country you helped build. The land your father's father called home is now legally and absolutely somewhere you are forbidden to stand. What makes this opening wound so searingly dramatic is not just the banishment itself, but the speed of it. One season you are the celebrated champion of Castile, a man whose name makes enemy commanders reconsider their career choices. The next you are packing what you can onto whatever horses you still own, watching your wife Jimena try to hold herself together at the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña, where she and your children will wait for how long nobody can say. Historians still argue whether Rodrigo fully understood in that moment that this exile might be permanent, or whether some part of him genuinely believed the king would cool down, reconsider, and send a very apologetic royal messenger within a few months. He did not. King Alfonso VI was not a man given to reconsidering. He was proud, politically calculating, and surrounded by courtiers who had been whispering against Rodrigo for years with the patience and dedication of people who had absolutely nothing better to do. The charge that finally stuck was insubordination of a rather spectacular kind. Rodrigo had led an unauthorized raid into the Taifa kingdom of Toledo, a territory that was at the time under the protection of Alfonso himself. Whether this was a genuine act of freelance aggression or a provocation engineered by his enemies at court is one of those questions that medieval sources love to leave conveniently ambiguous. The raid happened. Toledo's ruler complained. Alfonso, who had his own delicate diplomatic arrangements with Toledo to protect, chose to make an example. The example was named Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, and the example was told to leave. What the king perhaps did not fully calculate, and this is the part that history finds quietly hilarious in retrospect, is that sending away your greatest military asset because some courtiers found him inconvenient is a bit like a football club releasing their star striker because he made the assistant coach feel self-conscious. The short-term political smoothness came at a long-term strategic cost that Alfonso would spend the rest of his reign trying to paper over. But on this particular morning, standing outside Burgos with the gates closed and the wind doing nothing helpful, Rodrigo is not thinking about Alfonso's long-term strategic miscalculations. He is thinking about survival. He is thinking about the men who chose to follow him into exile, a small, loyal corps of soldiers who apparently decided that their future lay with a banished knight rather than a comfortable posting inside the city walls. He is thinking about money because armies, even small personal ones, require food and wages and the occasional piece of equipment that does not fall apart mid-battle. There is a famous story, charming and almost certainly embellished, that before leaving Burgos, Rodrigo visited 2 local moneylenders named Raquel and Vidas and offered them chests of sand disguised as treasure in exchange for quick financing. The story is almost certainly more legend than ledger entry, but it tells you something important about how people remembered this moment. Even in his lowest hour, the storytellers needed Rodrigo to be clever. They needed him to be winning something, even if it was just a small con against a pair of credulous lenders. A hero who simply rides away, broken, defeated, is not a story anyone wants to carry across the centuries. So the legend gave him one last Castilian trick before the border. The gates of Burgos do not open. The road east stretches ahead of you, dusty and indifferent. Behind you, somewhere inside those walls, the court is already reorganizing itself around your absence, redistributing your influence, pretending you were never quite as essential as everyone knew you were. And ahead of you, well, ahead of you is everything. The Moorish courts of the Taifa kingdoms, the battlefields of fractured Iberia, the long years of a man remaking himself from discarded champion into something the history books would spend the next 1,000 years arguing about. You put one foot in front of the other, and the story begins. You did not become the man standing outside those locked gates of Burgos by accident. Nobody is born knowing how to hold a sword correctly, how to read a battlefield the way a farmer reads weather, how to inspire exhausted men to keep moving when every muscle in their bodies is politely requesting a long retirement. That kind of knowing gets built slowly and often painfully, over years of watching, practicing, failing and watching again. And for Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, the building started early in a small town north of Burgos called Vivar del Cid, which, to be fair, only got the second half of that name much later, once the town realized it had produced someone worth naming. Things after. You grow up in the middle of the 11th century in a Castile that is permanently mid-argument with itself and everyone around it. The Iberian Peninsula at this point is not a tidy political map with clean borders and cooperative neighbours. It is a patchwork of Christian kingdoms in the north, Castile, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, and a collection of Muslim Taifa states in the centre and south, all of them jostling, trading, raiding, and occasionally allying with whoever seemed useful that particular Tuesday. The old Caliphate of Córdoba, which had once held most of the peninsula under a single sophisticated administration, had collapsed roughly a generation before Rodrigo's birth, shattering into these smaller Taifa kingdoms like a dropped ceramic plate. Everyone was picking up the pieces and trying to claim the best ones. Into this world you are born somewhere around 1043, give or take a few years that the historical record shrugs about. Your father is Diego Lainez, a minor Castilian nobleman, not wealthy by any grand standard, but connected enough to matter. The family traces its lineage back to a figure called Laín Calvo, one of the legendary judges of Castile, which sounds impressive until you realize that medieval genealogies had a tendency to acquire impressive ancestors the way old houses acquire damp, quietly, persistently, and almost impossible to verify. Still, the name meant something. It meant you belonged somewhere, which in 11th century Iberia was not nothing. What shapes you more than the family name, though, is where you are sent to be educated. As a boy of good family, you are placed in the household of the Infante Sancho, the eldest son of King Ferdinand I of Castile and Leon. This was standard practice for young noblemen of the period, a system called being a page, essentially an apprenticeship in how to be useful to power. You learn to ride properly. You learn weapons. You learn the etiquette of a royal court, which is really just the art of being useful without appearing, threatening a skill that requires considerably more intelligence than it sounds. Historians still argue whether Rodrigo and Sancho developed a genuine friendship during these years, or whether it was always primarily a relationship of mutual political utility dressed up in the language of loyalty. The chronicles lean toward genuine warmth. The cynics note that genuine warmth and political utility are not mutually exclusive. Here is the quirky detail that tends to get left out of the dramatic retellings. The household education Rodrigo received almost certainly included training in the Mozarabic legal traditions, the hybrid legal customs practiced by Christians, living under Moorish rule in the south. This gave Rodrigo something unusual among northern Castilian warriors of his generation: a working familiarity with the cultural and administrative logic of the Muslim taifas. He would later spend so much of his life fighting alongside, fighting against, and occasionally governing. The education that seemed purely ornamental would turn out to be one of the most practically useful things anyone ever accidentally gave him. By the time Rodrigo is in his late teenage years, he is training seriously under a knight named Jimeno Garcés, or possibly Pedro Pardo, depending on which source you trust, and the sources here are doing their usual medieval thing of disagreeing cheerfully about minor details. What matters is that someone with experience is sharpening what nature and circumstance already provided. Because Rodrigo, by every account that survives, was not just competent. He was gifted in the specific unnerving way that truly exceptional military minds tend to be gifted with an instinct for the shape of a fight before it fully forms a capacity to hold multiple tactical possibilities in his head simultaneously, and a physical courage that his contemporaries noted again and again without ever quite being able to explain it. He is also, and this is worth saying plainly, not especially easy to manage. Even as a young man, Rodrigo has opinions. He has a sense of his own worth that does not automatically defer to rank. He respects competence and tends to be visibly unimpressed by incompetence regardless of what title is attached to it. In a feudal court structure built entirely on the performance of deference to hierarchy, this quality is both an asset and a slow-burning liability. It makes men want to follow him. It makes powerful men want to be rid of him. Both of those things will remain true for the rest of his life with a consistency that is almost mathematically reliable. The Castile of his youth is also a place of constant grinding border violence. Raids across the frontier between Christian North and Muslim South are not exceptional events, they are essentially the regional economy. Cattle prisoners, tribute payments, contested towns that change hands and change back again. You grow up understanding that the border is not a line on a document, but a lived, negotiated, dangerous reality that requires constant management. This is not a childhood that produces people who are easily shocked by the messiness of conflict. It produces people who are very good at navigating it. By the time you are old enough to fight in earnest, you are already thinking like a commander rather than a foot soldier. You are already watching the senior knights and noting what they do right and, more importantly, what they do wrong. You are filing it away with the methodical quiet of someone who understands at some level not yet fully articulated that everything you are learning right now is going to matter enormously later. You just do not know yet how far away from home that later is going to take you. The court of Infante Sancho hums around you, warm and politically charged and full of men competing for position. You are not yet the legend. You are not yet the exile. You are simply the sharpest young knight in the room, watching, waiting, and getting ready. The moment that first makes your name echo beyond the training yards and royal corridors arrives not with a grand announcement, but with a single combat that nobody expected to define a career. You are still a young man, barely past the threshold of what anyone would call seasoned. When Sancho, now King Sancho II of Castile, following his father Ferdinand's death, designates you as his personal champion. The title sounds ceremonial until you understand what it actually means in practical 11th century terms. It means that when a dispute between kingdoms reaches the point where words have exhausted themselves and both sides agree to settle the matter through single combat between chosen representatives, you are the body Castile sends forward. You are the argument made flesh. You are the punctuation mark at the end of a very long political sentence. The weight of that responsibility would flatten most people. You find it clarifying. Your first documented trial by combat comes against a Navarrese champion named Jimeno Garcés, a name that may sound familiar because some sources suggest he was connected to your own early training, which would make the encounter either deeply ironic or completely fabricated by chroniclers who loved a good narrative symmetry. Historians still argue whether this particular duel happened precisely as described or whether the details accumulated in the retelling like barnacles on a ship hull. What the sources agree on is the outcome: Rodrigo wins, Castile's territorial claim is upheld, and the young champion from Vivar suddenly has a reputation that travels faster than he does. The title that begins attaching itself to you around this period is not yet El Cid. That name comes later, carried in from a different language entirely. What you are called now in the Castilian vernacular of the northern courts is El Campeador, the champion, the one who fights in the field on behalf of others. It is a professional designation that somehow tips over into something more personal, to more mythological, the way certain titles do when the person wearing them is exceptional enough to make the label feel like it was invented specifically for them. Under Sancho, you fight not just in single combat but in genuine military campaigns, and here is where the education of your youth begins paying its most dramatic dividends. Sancho is ambitious in the aggressive, restless way of eldest sons, who watched their father divide the kingdom among multiple heirs, and found the arrangement philosophically unacceptable. Ferdinand I, on his deathbed, had split his holdings between his children. Sancho received Castile, Alfonso received, Leon Garcia received Galicia, and the two sisters received smaller territories. To Sancho, this looked less like a father's generous provision and more like an administrative catastrophe waiting to happen. He set about correcting it with considerable military enthusiasm, and you are the instrument of that correction. The campaigns that follow across the early 1070s are a masterclass in what a talented commander, backed by genuine royal authority, can accomplish. Sancho moves against his brothers with a calculated aggression that keeps his enemies perpetually off balance. You ride at the center of it, making tactical decisions that demonstrate something increasingly obvious to everyone watching. You are not simply brave. Bravery is common enough on medieval battlefields, where the alternative to fighting is usually something considerably worse. What you have is judgment. You understand when to press an advantage and when restraint will serve better. You understand terrain and logistics and the psychology of men under pressure in ways that most of your contemporaries are still working out theoretically. The Battle of Lantada in 1068, a confrontation between Sancho and his brother Alfonso, ends in Castilian victory. The Battle of Golpejera in 1072 ends the same way, with Alfonso himself captured and briefly imprisoned before being sent into exile. Sancho's ambition is working. The fractured inheritance is being reassembled by force, and you are the force doing most of the assembling. Here is the quietly extraordinary historical footnote that tends to disappear between the bigger dramatic moments during this period of Castilian expansion. Rodrigo develops working relationships with several Moorish Taifa rulers who are navigating their own complicated arrangements with the Christian North. These are not friendships exactly. The word carries too much modern warmth for what were essentially sophisticated political partnerships, but they are something more than the clean enemy versus ally binary that later storytellers preferred. You are learning in real time that the Iberian Peninsula operates on a logic more fluid and more interesting than the religious conflict framing suggests. Christian lords ally with Muslim rulers against other Christian lords. Muslim taifas pay tribute to Christian kings while maintaining their own internal sovereignty. The lines are blurry, and the blur is often where the actual power lives. Sancho, meanwhile, is winning. Garcia has been defeated and exiled to the Moorish south. Alfonso is neutralized. The remaining territories are folding into Castilian control with what must feel to Sancho like the satisfying progress of a plan coming together. You are at his side through all of it, loyal with the specific intensity of someone whose own identity has become bound up in the success of the enterprise. And then in 1072, at the siege of the city of Zamora, controlled by Sancho's sister Urraca, who has refused to surrender her inheritance without a fight, that history will find thoroughly justified. In retrospect, everything stops. A man named Belido Dolfos emerges from the city gates under what appears to be the pretense of defection. He approaches Sancho privately away from the main body of the army, with what he claims is vital information about a secret entrance into Zamora. Sancho, perhaps tired, perhaps trusting, perhaps simply unlucky in the way that powerful men sometimes are at the worst possible moments, goes with him. He does not come back. Belido Dolfos kills him, stabbing him with a lance by most accounts, and retreats back inside the city walls before anyone can respond. The Castilian army stands outside Zamora with a dead king and no plan. You arrive too late to stop it, and almost certainly too late to catch the assassin, though some accounts insist you gave chase on horseback with the kind of furious speed that grief and rage combined can produce in a person. The man you built your identity around is gone. The campaign is over. And waiting in the wings, watching from his exile, is his brother Alfonso, the man you helped defeat, the man you helped imprison, the man who is now, with the convenient death of Sancho, the only viable heir to everything Sancho spent years conquering. You are about to be asked to serve the person you just spent years fighting against. Medieval politics, you are discovering, has a very particular sense of humor. There is a specific kind of psychological discomfort that comes with kneeling before a man you recently helped defeat in battle, and you are about to experience it in the most public, most formalized, most carefully choreographed way that 11th century Castilian court protocol can arrange. Alfonso VI rides back from his Moorish exile in Toledo with the measured dignity of someone who has been rehearsing this entrance for months, which he probably has. He is now King of Leon, King of Castile, and gradually King of Galicia, as the remaining pieces of his father's divided inheritance fall back into a single pair of royal hands. He is, by any reasonable political metric, the most powerful Christian ruler on the Iberian Peninsula, and he knows, because everyone knows, that the most dangerous man in his new consolidated kingdom is the one currently trying to decide how much of his pride he can swallow without choking. You are not alone in your discomfort. The core of Sancho's loyal military household shares it. These are men who fought hard for a cause that has now been rendered historically inconvenient by an assassin's lance outside Zamora. But loyalty to a dead king does not pay wages or protect families, and the practical arithmetic of survival in feudal Castile points in one direction. You serve Alfonso, or you have nothing. What happens next is one of the most dramatically satisfying moments in the entire saga, and also one of the most historically debated. Before the assembled nobility of Castile and Leon in a formal ceremony at the church of Santa Gadea in Burgos, you demand that Alfonso swear a public oath. The oath is specific and extraordinary. Alfonso must swear on holy relics that he had no part in the murder of his brother Sancho outside Zamora. The implication hangs in the air of that church like incense, smoke, thick, unmistakable, and impossible to pretend you cannot smell. Historians still argue whether Rodrigo genuinely believed Alfonso was complicit in Sancho's assassination, or whether the Santa Gadea oath was a calculated political performance designed to establish dominance in the new power. Arrangement from the very first scene. The chronicles describe Alfonso's face during the ceremony with the kind of careful diplomatic vagueness that suggests the witnesses knew they were watching something they would be asked about later. He swears the oath 3 times by some accounts, with Rodrigo pressing each repetition like a man who wants to be very sure the point has landed. Alfonso complies. But his eyes, if the storytellers are to be believed at all, are saying something considerably less compliant. You have just made an enemy of your new king before your service has technically begun. Well done. Extremely subtle. No possible consequences whatsoever. To be fair to Rodrigo, and fairness does seem warranted here, the oath ceremony was not simply personal bravado. It served a genuine political function. It signaled to the Castilian nobility that their champion had not simply rolled over, that there was a check on Alfonso's authority, that the transition of power came with conditions attached. In a court where power was negotiated through exactly these kinds of public performances, forcing the king to swear was not just bold, it was structurally meaningful. It told everyone watching where the lines were being drawn. What it also did, unfortunately, was give Alfonso a grievance he would carry with the dedicated patience of someone who fully intends to use it when the moment is right. The early years of your service under Alfonso are, despite everything, genuinely productive. You are too valuable to sideline, and Alfonso is too intelligent to waste assets out of personal pique, at least not immediately. You lead military campaigns along the frontier with the competence that by now everyone simply expects from you. You collect tribute from Moorish Taifa rulers on behalf of the Castilian crown, a role that requires exactly the cross-cultural fluency you developed during your youth in Sancho's household and refined during the subsequent campaigns. The Taifa kings who negotiate with you discover quickly that you are firm, knowledgeable about their internal politics, and disinclined to be impressed by status-alone qualities they find simultaneously irritating and deeply respectable. You also, during this period, get married. Jimena Diaz enters your life as your wife, and she is not a minor figure tucked decoratively into the margins of your story. She is a noble woman of Leon, possibly a niece of King Alfonso himself, depending on which genealogical account you trust, and the marriage is both a genuine partnership and a political signal that you are establishing roots in the new order. The chronicles that survive paint Jimena with more dimension than medieval sources, typically grant women she is present in your decisions, She manages your affairs during your absences. And when exile comes, she faces it with a composure that the storytellers clearly found as remarkable as your battlefield performances. You will have children together. You will spend long stretches apart. The marriage will hold through things that would collapse most modern relationships, let alone 11th century ones. The court around you hums with the particular energy of a newly consolidated kingdom still working out its internal hierarchy. Alfonso's advisors and favourites are Leon men, many of them with the institutional memory and court connections that come from having backed the winning brother from the beginning. They look at you, Sancho's champion, the man who forced the oath at Santa Gadea. The one whose military reputation means Alfonso cannot simply dismiss him with the careful, calculating attention of people who intend to wait you out. You can feel it. The wariness in rooms when you enter. The conversations that pause a half-beat too long. The small diplomatic exclusions meetings you are not invited to, decisions made without your consultation on matters that fall squarely within your area of competence. None of it is enough to act on. All of it is enough to understand. The Castilian court has accepted you back into its structure the way a body accepts a splinter, surrounded, managed, and quietly working on removal. You serve, you campaign, you collect tribute. You do the job with the professionalism of someone who understands that the job itself is currently the only thing standing between your family and destitution. And you watch the faces of the men around Alfonso the way you watch enemy lines before a battle, looking for the moment when the arrangement tips from managed tension into open hostility. You do not have to wait as long as you might have hoped. The enemies you cannot see are already composing the letters that will end this chapter of your life, and they are choosing their words with the practiced care of men who have been waiting for exactly the right combination of circumstance and royal irritation to finally permanently get rid of. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar. They are nearly there. The trap, when it finally closes, does not announce itself with dramatic fanfare. It arrives the way most political destruction arrives, wrapped in the ordinary language of military necessity, dressed up as a routine frontier matter, and carrying just enough ambiguity that the man walking into it cannot be entirely certain, until the very last moment, that it is a trap at all. You are operating in the volatile borderlands of eastern Castile, in 1079, and the situation on the ground is exactly the kind of complicated, fast-moving mess that Frontier Command always produces. News travels slowly. Instructions from the capital are perpetually out of date by the time they arrive. A commander in the field has to make judgment calls with incomplete information and no time to consult anyone who outranks him. This is the environment in which your enemies have decided to destroy you, and they have chosen it deliberately. The immediate trigger is a raid. The Taifa kingdom of Toledo, ruled at this point by Al-Qadir, sits in a uniquely uncomfortable political position. It is officially under the protection of Alfonso VI, who has cultivated Toledo as a client state with the long-term strategic vision of eventually absorbing it entirely, which he will in 1095, but that is still years away. Toledo's protected status means that any military action against its territory by a Castilian commander, without explicit royal authorization, constitutes a serious breach of the king's diplomatic arrangements. It is the kind of offense that Alfonso cannot afford to ignore, because ignoring it would signal to every Taifa ruler in Iberia that his guarantees of protection are worthless. Into this carefully balanced situation rides the Taifa ruler of Granada, who launches an attack on Toledo's territory. Whether this attack was provoked, opportunistic, or part of a larger pattern of regional aggression is one of those questions the sources answer differently depending on which side they were written from. What matters for your purposes is that you, as the senior Castilian military commander in the region, make a decision. You lead a retaliatory raid into the lands of Granada, and in doing so you cross into territory that falls under the complex overlapping protection arrangements that Alfonso has spent years carefully constructing. There it is, the moment your enemies have been waiting for. Now, to be absolutely clear about something that the dramatic retelling sometimes obscures, Rodrigo's raid was not a reckless act of personal aggression by a man who had simply stopped paying attention. The military logic was defensible. Toledo was being attacked. Toledo was under Castilian protection. Responding to an attack on a protected client state could reasonably be argued as falling within the scope of a frontier commander's authority. You almost certainly made this argument yourself later to anyone who would listen. The problem is that almost certainly and reasonably argued are not the same as authorized and in the court of Alfonso VI, where your enemies have been cultivating the king's existing irritation with practiced patience for years. The distinction between defensible judgment and insubordinate overreach is going to be drawn in the least favorable way possible. The letters reach Alfonso with a speed that suggests they were ready before the raid was finished. Historians still argue about the degree to which the timing was coordinated, whether Rodrigo's enemies at court had advanced knowledge of the Granada attack and positioned themselves to exploit whatever response he made, or whether they simply moved with impressive opportunistic efficiency once the news arrived. Either way, the framing they apply to the raid in their communications to the king is devastating in its simplicity. Rodrigo acted without authorization. Rodrigo endangered the king's diplomatic arrangements with Toledo. Rodrigo once again has decided that his own military judgment supersedes the royal will. That last point lands differently given the history, given Santa Gadea, given the oath ceremony where Rodrigo pressed the king 3 times in front of the assembled nobility, given every small friction and barely concealed resentment of the past several years. Alfonso does not have to be persuaded that Rodrigo is capable of insubordination. He just has to be given a formal, documentable, politically justifiable reason to act on what he already believes. The letters provide exactly that. There is a secondary charge that surfaces in some accounts equally damaging in its way, that during the same period, Rodrigo conducted an unauthorized raid into the region of La Rioja, plundering territory and keeping the proceeds rather than forwarding them to the royal treasury as protocol required. Whether this charge is accurate, exaggerated, or largely invented by the same court faction that was already busy with the Toledo narrative, is another of those questions medieval sources handle with maddening inconsistency. What it does is add texture to the portrait being painted for Alfonso, not just a commander who overstepped once in a moment of frontier urgency, but a pattern of a man who operates as though the rules that apply to everyone else are more like suggestions when applied to him. The portrait is effective because it contains enough truth to be recognizable. Rodrigo does operate with unusual independence. He always has. The quality that makes him exceptional in the field, the willingness to make rapid, decisive, unconventional choices without waiting for permission that may never arrive, is exactly the quality that makes him ungovernable in the political imagination of men who need everything to flow through proper channels. Alfonso receives the letters. Alfonso consults his advisors, among whom the faction that wants Rodrigo gone is now confidently in the majority. Alfonso makes his decision with the cold efficiency of a king who has been given what he needs and does not intend to waste it. The decree goes out. You have 9 days. The exact number varies by source. Some say 6, some say 30. And the disagreement itself tells you something about how chaotic the timeline feels from the inside to remove yourself from Castilian territory. Your properties are subject to royal seizure. Anyone who shelters you or provides you with material assistance faces confiscation of their own holdings. The sentence is total, and it is immediate, and it leaves approximately no room for appeal. You receive the news somewhere on the frontier, away from Burgos, away from Jimena, away from the life you have spent years carefully rebuilding after the death of Sancho. The men around you watch your face for the information that your face by long military habit does not freely give. You absorb it. You calculate. You begin, with the methodical focus of someone who has survived enough chaos to know that panic is a luxury you cannot currently afford to think about what comes next. What comes next is not surrender. It was never going to be surrender. But what it is, exactly, that is still being decided somewhere behind eyes that have learned to give nothing away. The clock is running. 9 days, or 6, or 30. The exact number almost does not matter when you are standing in the middle of it, because time under that kind of pressure does not move the way it normally does. It compresses and stretches simultaneously. the way it does in the moments before a battle when your body knows something enormous is coming and your mind is still pretending it can think its way to a clean solution. You have been given a countdown and a boundary and a set of consequences for crossing either one and the machinery of your life, the properties, the income, the social position, the network of obligations and loyalties that constitute a nobleman's existence in 11th century. Castile is already being dismantled behind you, while you are still figuring out which direction to walk. The first practical problem is money. Not in the abstract philosophical sense that money is always a concern, but in the immediate logistical sense that an army, even a small personal one, even a loyal corps of knights who have chosen exile over comfort, requires continuous financial input just to exist. Horses eat, men eat. Equipment breaks and needs replacement. The entire medieval military enterprise runs on a supply chain that requires someone somewhere to be converting assets into coin on a regular basis. Your Castilian properties are gone, seized, or soon to be seized by the royal decree that is currently making its way through the administrative machinery of Alfonso's court. Your income from tribute collection is finished. You are, in the bluntest possible terms, starting from nothing. This is the context in which the story of Raquel and Vidas enters the legend, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, even knowing that most serious historians treat it as creative embellishment rather than documented fact. The tale goes like this. Before leaving Burgos, you approach two Jewish moneylenders and offer them two sealed chests as collateral for a substantial loan, with the understanding that the chests contain gold and silver and are not to be opened for a year. The chests in the story contain sand. You ride away with the cash. The moneylenders eventually open the chests and discover the deception, but by then you are long gone and considerably better funded. The story is almost certainly not true in its literal details. What it is, however, is culturally revealing in ways that reward a moment's attention. The medieval poets who preserved and embellished this episode were not trying to portray Rodrigo as a common swindler. They were making a point about resourcefulness under impossible pressure, about a man so thoroughly stripped of legitimate options that he has to improvise with whatever the situation offers. The fact that the victims are moneylenders, a profession viewed with deep ambivalence in medieval Christian society, removes the moral sting the story might otherwise carry. Historians still argue about whether any financial transaction with Burgos lenders actually occurred, or whether the entire episode was invented wholesale to give the exile narrative a memorable opening act. What is not invented is the gathering of men. This part is real, documented in enough independent sources to be treated as historical rather than legendary. In the days between the decree and the border crossing, Rodrigo assembles a force. The numbers are modest by the standards of royal armies, perhaps a few hundred fighting men at the outset, a mixture of Castilian knights who have chosen loyalty to their commander over comfort in the capital, and volunteers attracted by reputation, by the prospect of adventure, or by the simple calculation that a man of Rodrigo's military skill is likely to find employment, likely to pay. Some of these men have families. Some of them are young enough that exile sounds more like opportunity than punishment. All of them are making a bet on a banished knight with no land, no income, and no clear destination. The farewell at the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña is the emotional center of this section of the story, and the chronicles handle it with a tenderness that feels genuine even across the distance of 1,000 years. Jimena is there with your children, daughters primarily in the accounts that survive. Though the exact composition of your family at this point is another detail the sources handle with gentle imprecision. The monastery has agreed to shelter them, which required a degree of institutional courage given the royal decree's explicit warnings about assistance to your household. The abbot's willingness to take that risk is either a testament to genuine religious principle or to the calculation that sheltering the family of El Campeador was likely to pay dividends eventually, and possibly both simultaneously. You hold the farewell with the controlled composure of someone who cannot afford to come apart in front of the men who have just staked their futures on your leadership. The chronicles describe it as deeply emotional tears embraces the particular anguish of a separation that has no clear end date attached to it. You do not know when you will see Jimena again. She does not know either. The children are young enough that the duration of your absence is a genuinely open question, and everyone present is aware of this without anyone saying it plainly. Medieval farewells did not traffic heavily in false reassurance. The people involved understood the stakes. You cross the border out of Castile with whatever you have managed to assemble in the time available. Behind you, the kingdom that produced you, trained you, celebrated you, and then discarded you, continues its political life with the indifference of institutions toward the individuals they consume. Alfonso's court reorganizes around your absence. Your properties are absorbed. The space you occupied closes over like water after a stone. Ahead of you is the Taifa-divided middle of the peninsula, a landscape of competing Muslim kingdoms that are collectively experiencing their own ongoing political crisis. The Almoravids, a powerful Berber dynasty from North Africa, religiously austere and militarily formidable, are beginning to make their presence felt across the Strait of Gibraltar, and the Taifa rulers of the Spanish interior are watching their approach with the anxiety of small landowners eyeing a flood on the horizon. They need capable military commanders. They need men who can fight effectively and who understand the complicated, layered politics of Iberian border warfare. You are, it turns out, exactly what the market requires. The irony is not lost on you, or at least the later storytellers assume it was not. The king who banished you for overstepping his diplomatic arrangements with the Moorish south has just released into that same south the most effective military mind in the peninsula, with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Alfonso will come to regret this arithmetic, but that particular regret is still assembling itself in the future. And right now you have a border behind you, a small army beside you, and a landscape full of possibilities that nobody has bothered to foreclose yet because nobody seriously thought you would end up here. You ride forward into the open, and the exile that was supposed to finish you begins instead to make you. The Taifa kingdoms you ride into are not, despite what the cleaner versions of this story sometimes suggest, enemy territory in any simple or absolute sense. They are something considerably more interesting than that. A collection of independent Muslim principalities that have been doing business, negotiating, fighting, and occasionally intermarrying with their Christian northern neighbors for generations, operating according to a political logic that prioritizes survival and advantage over religious solidarity in ways that would have deeply confused anyone expecting the Iberian Peninsula to behave like a straightforward holy war. The rulers of these kingdoms are sophisticated men. They read, they correspond with scholars and poets and administrators across the wider Islamic world. They also understand, with the unsentimental clarity of people who have been navigating impossible geopolitical situations since the caliphate collapsed, that a talented Christian mercenary commander with no allegiance to any crown is an asset worth acquiring. Your first significant employer in exile is Al-Muqtadir of Zaragoza. And then after his death, his son Al-Mutamin, and the arrangement that develops between you is genuinely fascinating to anyone who cares about the gap between how medieval Iberia imagined itself and how it actually functioned. You are a Christian knight, exiled by a Christian king serving a Muslim ruler, fighting battles against both Muslim and Christian opponents depending on what the political situation requires in any given season. The neat binary of Reconquista Christian North, pushing back against Muslim South, in a coherent religious project is already complicated enough in theory. Your career in Zaragoza makes it almost laughably inadequate as a description of what is actually happening on the ground. Al-Mutamin's Zaragoza is, by the standards of 11th century Iberia, a genuinely cosmopolitan place. It has a substantial Jewish community, a significant Christian minority population, scholars working in Arabic and Latin simultaneously, and a court culture that values intellectual sophistication alongside military capability. You are not in this environment a curiosity or an anomaly. You are a professional, and professionals of sufficient skill have always found that competence travels across boundaries that ideology insists should be impassable. The quirky historical detail that tends to surprise people encountering this period for the first time is that Rodrigo almost certainly worshipped in Christian churches within Zaragoza without this causing any particular administrative difficulty. The Taifa courts were by the standards of their time and by many standards beyond it. remarkably tolerant of religious pluralism among people who were being practically useful. What you bring to Zaragoza, and to the string of campaigns that follow, is not just sword skill. Any competent knight brings sword skill. What you bring is strategic intelligence of a quality that the Taifa rulers around you quickly recognize as categorically different from what they have available through normal channels. You understand logistics, the unglamorous science of keeping an army fed, equipped and mobile over extended campaigns in difficult terrain. You understand the psychology of opposing commanders, how to read their likely responses to your movements, how to present them with choices where every option available to them leads somewhere you want them to go. And you understand the specific geography of eastern Iberia, with the granular intimacy of someone who has been fighting across it since young adulthood. The campaigns you conduct for the Zaragoza Taifa demonstrate all of this in quick succession. You face opponents who include the King of Aragon and the Count of Barcelona, Christian rulers both, and you defeat them with a consistency that begins attracting the kind of attention that transcends the immediate military context. The Count of Barcelona, Ramon Berenguer II, encounters you in battle at Almenar in 1079, early in your exile, and the encounter does not go well for him. He will encounter you again later with similarly unhappy results, and the repetition will give your relationship with Barcelona the quality of a running joke where only one party is laughing. Historians still argue about the precise tactical details of these engagements, but the outcomes are clear enough. You win, your employer's territorial position improves, and your personal reputation expands, with each campaign like a financial instrument accumulating interest. The income from this arrangement is real and substantial. Taifa rulers paid their military commanders well, partly because the competition for effective commanders was genuine, and partly because the Almoravid pressure from the south was making everyone increasingly anxious to secure the best available talent before circumstances made such securing impossible. You are building something during these years that has no formal name in the feudal vocabulary of the time. A private military household essentially sustained by campaign income and tribute, rather than land grants, loyal to you personally, rather than to any crown or territory. It is a genuinely novel organizational structure for the period. And it works because you make it work through the combination of consistent military success and a personal authority that keeps men committed to the enterprise, even during the inevitable lean periods. There is a human texture to these years that the epic sources mostly skip past in their eagerness to get to the dramatic set pieces. You are living in Moorish courts, eating Moorish food, navigating social protocols that differ in their details from the Castilian norms you grew up with. You are learning, if you have not already fully learned, that the civilizational divide between Christian North and Muslim South is considerably more permeable than either side's official rhetoric acknowledges. The scholars and administrators of Zaragoza are not figures of darkness and foreign threat. They are in many cases considerably more educated than the Christian noblemen you grew up alongside, and their courts operate with an administrative sophistication that the northern kingdoms are still in several respects working to match. None of this makes you less Castilian. None of it shakes the Christian identity that is by every account genuinely held rather than performed. What it does is expand the operational map in your mind, adding layers of cultural and political understanding that will prove in the years ahead invaluable. A man who can negotiate effectively in both worlds, who understands the internal logic of both the Christian feudal courts and the Moorish Taifa administrations, who has earned genuine respect from rulers on both sides of the nominal divide, that man has options that simply do not exist for people who stayed safely within the familiar. Your enemies in Alfonso's court sent you away to diminish you. They sent you into what they imagined was the wilderness, the dangerous and degrading margins of a world organized around Castilian Christian power. What they actually did, with the magnificent inadvertence of people who are clever enough to maneuver but not wise enough to foresee, was send you to school. The education is going extremely well. Back in Burgos, the court continues without you managing the frontier with the resources available, watching the Almoravid situation develop with growing unease and occasionally receiving reports of a Castilian exile in Zaragoza who keeps winning battles he has no business winning. Alfonso reads those reports with an expression that the chroniclers wisely do not attempt to describe. There is a particular freedom that arrives paradoxically when everything has been taken from you. Not the romantic, poetic kind of freedom that sounds appealing in the abstract and dissolves on contact with actual deprivation, but a harder, more functional variety. The freedom of a man who has already lost the thing he was afraid of losing. You have no land. You have no title that derives from royal favor. You have no position within the feudal hierarchy that can be revoked by a king's bad morning or a courtier's well-timed letter. What you have instead is a reputation, a band of loyal men, a set of skills that the market values highly, and a mind that has been stripped of the particular paralysis that comes from having too much to protect. In a strange and thoroughly unplanned way, Alfonso's decree has made you more dangerous than you were before it. But freedom without structure is just chaos wearing a hopeful expression, and you are not a chaotic man. One of the things that becomes increasingly apparent to everyone who deals with you during these exile years, allies, employers, opponents, the various Taifa administrators who have to actually work with you on a daily basis, is that you operate according to a personal code that is rigid in its essentials, even when it is flexible in its applications. Understanding that code is understanding why a man, who could have simply become a wandering mercenary, selling his sword to whoever offered the best terms each season, instead becomes something considerably more consequential. The first principle of that code, and the one that surprises people most given the circumstances, is loyalty. Not loyalty to crowns or kingdoms which have demonstrated their reliability in your specific case rather comprehensively, but loyalty to the men who follow you and to the agreements you make with your employers. This sounds like the minimum requirement for basic professional function. But in the context of 11th century mercenary culture, where betrayal and sudden realignment were standard tools of career management, it is actually distinctive. The men in your household know with a certainty they would not have in most comparable arrangements that you will not sell them out for a better offer. You will not abandon a campaign mid-execution because someone across the valley has waved a larger purse. When you make a commitment, the commitment holds until the circumstances that generated it change in ways that both parties can acknowledge openly. The second principle is what you might call proportional response, and it operates in both directions. You are not gratuitously brutal. The accounts of your campaigns in this period are notably short on the kind of indiscriminate civilian destruction that medieval warfare often produced. Not because you are a pacifist. The battlefield record makes that characterization obviously untenable, but because you understand that terrorizing populations you may need to govern or negotiate with later is strategically counterproductive. At the same time, you are entirely capable of devastating precision when the situation calls for it. Enemies who break agreements with you, commanders who underestimate you, rulers who attempt to play both sides of an arrangement that involves your men's lives. These individuals discover that proportional response cuts both ways. Here is the quirky administrative detail that historians find genuinely interesting, and that tends to get lost between the battles during his years. Operating in the Taifa territories, Rodrigo developed what amounts to a sophisticated system of tribute management that functioned almost like a private taxation network. Towns and territories in his operational zone paid regular sums in exchange for protection. Protection primarily from him. It should be noted, though the arrangement was not typically framed in those precise terms, because medieval euphemism was a well-developed art form. The income from this network, combined with campaign payments from his Taifar employers, gave your operation a financial stability that pure battlefield plunder could never have provided. You were building an economy, not just winning fights. The third principle, and perhaps the most important for understanding what comes later, is patience. You are not in a hurry in the way that lesser men with something to prove tend to be in a hurry. You do not make dramatic gestures toward reclaiming your Castilian position before the conditions for reclaiming it are actually present. You do not pick unnecessary fights with Alfonso or with his allies in ways that would make eventual reconciliation impossible, even during the years when the temptation to do so must be considerable. You are building steadily and without announcing it toward something. The exact shape of that something shifts as circumstances shift, but the building continues. Historians still argue about whether Rodrigo had a long-term strategic vision from early in his exile, or whether he was improvising brilliantly. And the retrospective narrative of a plan is something later chroniclers imposed on what was actually adaptive opportunism. The honest answer is probably that the distinction matters less than it appears to. Brilliant improvisation and long-term strategic vision produce the same behavioral signature in a sufficiently capable person, consistent choices that accumulate over time into a position of strength that looks inevitable in hindsight, even though it was anything but inevitable in prospect. What you are also doing during these years, whether consciously or not, is building a legend. Not the literary legend that comes later after the poets get involved, but the living operational legend of a man whose reputation precedes him into every negotiation and every battlefield. This kind of reputation is a genuine strategic asset distinct from actual military capability, though it grows from it. When a Taifa ruler hears that Rodrigo Díaz is approaching with his household force, the ruler's calculation shifts before a single engagement has occurred. When a Christian commander on the other side of a frontier receives intelligence about your movements, his options narrow in ways that would not apply to a commander of equivalent technical skill but lesser reputation. Fear properly earned and carefully maintained is a force multiplier that costs nothing to deploy once it exists. The men who follow you through these years are absorbing all of this consciously and otherwise. They are learning from proximity what military leadership at its highest functional level actually looks like. They are also, and this matters for the longer story, becoming genuinely excellent soldiers through continuous operational experience. Your household force in the middle years of exile is not the improvised collection of loyalists and volunteers who crossed the Castilian border with you. It is a hardened, experienced, cohesive unit that has been tested repeatedly and knows itself well. It fights with the coordinated confidence of men who have operated together long enough to communicate in the shorthand of shared experience. You are, in other words, building an army out of an exile, building a court out of a wandering band, building a state almost out of nothing, though that particular word is still some years away from being accurate. And the city that will make it accurate is still sitting on the eastern coast of Iberia, wealthy and walled and entirely unaware that it has already been chosen. You know what you are moving toward, even if the path between here and there has not yet revealed all its turns. The man without a country is becoming quietly and methodically a country unto himself. The map of Iberia in the 1080s looks to anyone trying to make sense of it from the outside like an argument that has been going on so long that everyone involved has forgotten what it was originally about. You have the Christian kingdoms of the north, Castile, Leon, Aragon, Navarre, competing with each other almost as vigorously as they compete with anyone else. You have the Taifa kingdoms of the center and south, internally fractured, financially pressured, watching the Almoravid military machine assembling itself across the Strait of Gibraltar with the specific dread of people who can see exactly what is coming but cannot agree on how to respond to it. And moving through all of this attached to no fixed point on the map is you conducting campaigns, collecting tribute, winning battles, and quietly redrawing the practical boundaries of influence in ways that the official political geography does not yet reflect, but eventually will have to acknowledge. The battles of this period do not arrive in the neat, well-documented sequence that later historians would prefer. Medieval record-keeping was enthusiastic about outcomes and vague about processes, which means that reconstructing the precise chronology of your military operations in the 1080s requires the kind of careful, speculative detective work that keeps academic careers productively occupied. What emerges from the available evidence is a portrait of relentless operational activity, campaign following campaign, with barely enough interval between them for equipment to be repaired and horses to be rested. You are not a man who wins one significant victory and then manages the reputation of it for a decade. You are winning continuously in different theatres against different opponents under different tactical conditions. The engagement at Morella in the highlands of what will eventually become the Valencian region is one of the cleaner examples of your operational method during this period. You identify a strategically significant position, you move to control it before your opponents fully understand what you are doing, and you consolidate your hold with the speed that prevents effective counter-organization. The tactical principle involved is not exotic. It is essentially the application of initiative and tempo to deny the enemy the time to respond coherently, but the consistent execution of it against opponents who know it is coming and still cannot stop. It is the mark of a commander operating at a level above his contemporaries. What is happening in parallel with these military campaigns is something that the battle-focused chronicles tend to underreport: a systematic expansion of your political network across the eastern territories of Iberia. You are not simply fighting through this landscape, you are negotiating with it, building relationships with local rulers and administrators that create a web of obligation and mutual interest, stretching from Zaragoza in the north down toward the Valencia coast in the south and east. Some of these relationships involve formal tribute arrangements. Some are looser alliances based on shared interest in keeping particular other parties out of the region. Some are personal connections built through the specific intimacy of men who have fought alongside each other and know from that experience what the other is worth under pressure. Historians still argue about the degree to which Rodrigo was consciously building toward Valencia during this period, or whether his eastward orientation was simply the natural result of following the most available opportunities. The debate is genuinely unresolvable with the evidence that survives. But it is worth noting that by the mid-1080s, your operational focus has shifted decisively toward the eastern coast in ways that look in retrospect like preparation, even if they were not explicitly framed that way at the time. Here is a militarily fascinating quirk of your campaigns in this period that tends to get overlooked in the broader narrative you developed. What can only be described as a mobile intelligence network using the commercial and diplomatic connections of the communities in your operational zone, including Jewish merchants, Mozarabic Christian traders, and Moorish administrators to gather information about enemy movements, garrison strengths, supply routes, and political tensions within opposing courts. This was not unprecedented in medieval warfare, but the systematic, institutionalized way you appear to have organized it was unusual for a commander without a fixed territorial base. You were running something that functioned like a state intelligence service, without technically having a state, which is either impressive organizational innovation or the most elaborate overcompensation for exile that military history has ever recorded, possibly both. The Christian kingdoms watch your progress with a mixture of reactions that the sources capture in fragments. Alfonso VI, back in Castile and Leon, is in the middle of his own significant strategic project, the absorption of Toledo, which falls to him in 1085, in what is genuinely one of the major geopolitical events of the century, and has limited bandwidth to devote to managing the activities of his most famous exile. The King of Aragon and the Count of Barcelona, both of whom have lost battles to you directly, regard your growing influence in the Eastern Territories with the particular irritation of men who have been embarrassed professionally and cannot immediately do anything about it. The Taifa rulers in your operational zone have by this point mostly arrived at the pragmatic conclusion that accommodation is more survivable than resistance, which is exactly the conclusion you have been methodically engineering them toward. The Almoravids, meanwhile, are no longer a distant concern. In 1086, they cross the strait in force at the invitation of the Taifa rulers, who have decided that Orthodox Berber military power is preferable to continued Christian encroachment, a calculation that will prove for most of the Taifa rulers involved to be catastrophically optimistic. At the Battle of Sagrajas, the Almoravid forces under Yusuf ibn Tashfin deal Alfonso VI the worst military defeat of his reign, killing a significant portion of his army and demonstrating with emphatic clarity that the balance of power in Iberia has just shifted in ways that nobody's existing strategic plans adequately account for. You are not at Sagrajas. The reasons for your absence are debated. Some sources suggest Alfonso did not request your presence, others that logistical timing made your participation impossible. Still, others that the political relationship between you and the king was still too damaged for cooperation even in crisis. Whatever the reason, the absence is significant. The battle that reshapes Iberian geopolitics happens without the peninsula's most effective military commander, and Alfonso survives it, diminished in ways that will have direct consequences for your own story. Because a king who has just been badly beaten by a force he did not adequately prepare for is a king who is suddenly urgently reconsidering which assets he has been leaving unused. The letter, when it eventually comes, will carry Alfonso's seal. And reading it, you will have to decide how much of the past 7 years of exile you are willing to set aside in the interest of a future that is still uncertain, but suddenly, for the first time in a long time, pointing in a direction that might eventually include home. You roll the possibility around in your mind the way you roll tactical problems, quietly, methodically, from every angle at once. The answer is not yet ready, but the question has finally arrived. The reconciliation, when it comes, has the texture of two people who have hurt each other, agreeing to pretend for practical reasons that the hurting did not happen. Alfonso needs you. The Almoravid defeat at Sagradas has punctured the confident momentum of his reign with the decisiveness of a blade finding a gap in armor, and the political landscape that made exiling his most effective commander seem like a manageable act of royal housekeeping now looks considerably different. You, for your part, need the legitimacy that only Alfonso can provide, the formal restoration of your Castilian identity, the legal standing that transforms you from a celebrated exile into something with recognized standing in the world your children will inherit. The negotiation between these two sets of needs produces a reconciliation in 1087 that both parties enter with open eyes, and residual grievances they are choosing for now to manage rather than resolve. You return to Castilian service with your private military household intact, your Eastern network of relationships undisturbed, and your reputation so thoroughly enhanced by 7 years of continuous military success that the court which celebrated your exile is now obliged to welcome you back with the performance, at least, of enthusiasm. The irony sits in the room during every formal reception like an uninvited guest that everyone can see and nobody is going to acknowledge out loud. You are gracious about it because graciousness in this situation costs you nothing, and petty triumphalism would cost you quite a lot. You have learned during the exile years that the management of your own pride is a strategic variable as important as any military one. The assignment Alfonso gives you is significant enough to confirm that the reconciliation is genuine in its operational dimension, even if it remains complicated in its personal one. You are sent to the Eastern Territories specifically to manage the increasingly volatile situation around Valencia and the surrounding regions, with a degree of autonomous authority that reflects both the trust the military situation requires and the practical reality that you are the only commander available with the network, the knowledge, and the relationships to function effectively in that environment. It is in a quietly satisfying way an assignment that could only be given to you. Your 7 years of exile, which were supposed to diminish, you have instead made you uniquely indispensable for exactly the task that now matters most. The Valencia situation is deteriorating with the speed that political vacuums tend to deteriorate. The Taifa ruler Al-Qadir is struggling to maintain his position against internal opposition, external pressure from neighboring Taifa rulers, and the growing shadow of Almoravid influence that is reshaping the political calculations of every Muslim ruler in the peninsula. The city itself is wealthy, strategically positioned on the Mediterranean coast, and defended by walls that represent serious military engineering. It is also increasingly apprised that multiple parties are positioning to claim each of them, hoping that the chaos of the current moment will provide the opening that direct assault would not. You arrive in the east with your household force and immediately begin the patient work of consolidating the situation according to your own priorities rather than anyone else's timetable. This is where the second exile begins, because Alfonso, receiving reports of your activities in the east that his advisors are once again framing in the least favorable light available, decides, in 1089, that you have overstepped your authority again, with a consistency that suggests either that you are constitutionally incapable of operating within sanctioned boundaries, or that Alfonso's court contains people of remarkable persistence who have made your removal their primary professional project. Historians still argue which interpretation is more accurate, and the honest answer is almost certainly that both are true simultaneously. The specific trigger this time involves your treatment of the Count of Barcelona's territories and your management of tribute arrangements in ways that Alfonso considers unauthorized. The decree of second exile arrives with the weary familiarity familiarity of a letter you have received before carrying the same essential message in slightly different administrative language. You are once again outside the boundaries of royal favour and inside the boundaries of royal territory at the same time, which is the legal combination that medieval Castile found most intolerable. What is different this time is everything else. You are not the man who stood outside Burgos the first time, scrambling to assemble a force and a plan from genuine scarcity. You have a network of relationships across the eastern territories that functions independently of Castilian royal authorization. You have, in the most practical sense, already built the infrastructure of sovereignty without yet having the city that would make it formal. The second exile does not strip you of these things the way the first stripped you of your Castilian life. It simply removes the last remaining constraint on using them entirely for your own purposes. And now your former allies compound the isolation. Several Castilian nobles who rode with you during the brief reconciliation period, men you had reason to consider dependable, quietly realign themselves with Alfonso's court position once the second exile becomes official. This is not shocking. Feudal loyalty was always more conditional than the literature preferred to admit, but it carries the specific sting of betrayal by people whose characters you thought you had accurately assessed. One or two of them you had actively assisted during the reconciliation period, using your Eastern network to smooth their various political difficulties in ways that cost you real capital. The discovery that this investment has not produced the loyalty you might reasonably have expected produces in you something that is not quite bitterness. You are too practical for pure bitterness, but is a permanent recalibration of your expectations about the reliability of men who have comfortable alternatives to loyalty. Here is the quietly devastating historical footnote about this period. Some of the intelligence that reached Alfonso regarding your Eastern activities almost certainly came from within your own operation, not from your core household whose loyalty the record supports consistently, but from the wider network of Iberian nobles and administrators who had relationships with both your camp and the Castilian court simultaneously. Medieval Iberia was small enough that most people of consequence knew most other people of consequence, and information moved through those personal networks with a fluidity that made genuine operational security essentially impossible. You were, in a sense, always operating in a fishbowl, and the fish watching you were not always friendly. The response you choose to the second exile is clarifying in what it reveals about how completely your psychological orientation has shifted since the first. The first exile produced grief urgency, the frantic energy of a man trying to survive a disaster. The second produces something closer to resolution. You are done waiting for Alfonso to remember your value. You are done with the cycle of service and suspicion, reconciliation and betrayal that has defined your relationship with Castilian royal power since the day Sancho died outside Zamora. You are going to build something permanent, something that does not depend on any king's continued goodwill, something that will still be standing when the political weather of the peninsula shifts again in whatever direction it shifts next. You know where that something has to be built. You have known for a while now, if you are honest with yourself, which you generally are when the audience is small enough. Valencia is waiting on its coast, wealthy and walled, and watching the horizon for whatever is coming next. You have decided to be what is coming next. Valencia sits on the eastern coast of Iberia, like a city that has spent centuries being told it is too valuable to leave alone, and has developed in response a kind of exhausted magnificence. The walls are serious. The agricultural hinterland, fed by an irrigation system of Roman origin that Arab engineers subsequently improved into something approaching agricultural poetry, produces rice, oranges, silk, and enough general abundance to make the city one of the wealthiest urban centers on the peninsula. The port connects it to Mediterranean trade networks that bring goods, ideas, and political complications from across a world considerably larger than the Iberian interior. It has a population of mixed faiths and backgrounds that has been managing its own internal complexity for generations, with the practiced pragmatism of people who have learned that coexistence is cheaper than the alternative. It is also, in the early 1090s, a city in the specific kind of trouble that wealth and strategic position reliably produce. Al-Qadir, the Taifa ruler you have been nominally supporting under Alfonso's earlier authorization, is clinging to power with the desperation of a man who understands that his removal is a matter of when rather than whether. The Almoravid pressure from the south is intensifying. The regional Taifa rulers who surround Valencia's territory are positioning themselves to take advantage of whatever instability Al-Qadir's eventual collapse produces. And the city's own population, watching their ruler's weakness with the calculating attention of people whose prosperity depends on stable governance, is quietly open to alternatives in ways that a sufficiently patient and strategically intelligent outside party might be able to exploit. You are the most sufficiently patient and strategically intelligent outside party currently operating in the region, and you have been studying Valencia's situation with the focused attention of someone who has already decided on the destination and is now working out the optimal route. The approach you choose is not the direct military assault that a less sophisticated commander might attempt. Valencia's walls are too strong, its garrison too capable, and a failed frontal assault would damage your reputation and your resources simultaneously. A combination you can afford neither militarily nor politically. Instead, you begin what will become one of the most remarkable exercises in patient strategic pressure that medieval Iberian history records. You start by systematically controlling the territory around Valencia, the towns, the roads, the agricultural zones, the passes through which supplies and reinforcements would need to travel. You are not yet besieging the city in the formal military sense. You are doing something more elegant and more devastating. You are making Valencia an island. The process takes time, and time is something you have made your peace with in ways that your opponents consistently underestimate. Each town that comes under your control or your influence tightens the perimeter around Valencia by another increment. Each road you dominate reduces the city's ability to receive outside assistance. Each local ruler who accommodates your presence rather than resisting it, and there are several because your reputation for honoring agreements makes accommodation a more attractive option than it would be with a commander of less consistent character, adds another layer to the strategic encirclement that is slowly, methodically becoming impossible to reverse. Historians still argue about the precise timeline of Rodrigo's approach to Valencia, partly because the sources documenting it were written from multiple perspectives with incompatible agendas, and partly because the campaign unfolded over several years in ways that make clean periodization difficult. What is clear is that by the early 1090s you have positioned yourself as the dominant military and political force in the Valencian region in ways that neither the remaining Taifa rulers nor the Almoravids watching from the south, nor Alfonso watching from Castile have been able to effectively counter. Al-Qadir's position inside Valencia deteriorates steadily through this period. He is paying you tribute, a reversal of the power relationship that both of you understand clearly, even if the formal language of the arrangement dresses it in more dignified terms. He is also paying tribute to other parties, trying to maintain his position through the time-honored Taifa strategy of spreading payments widely enough that no single external power has sufficient grievance to move against him decisively. It is a strategy that worked for a generation of Taifa rulers after the caliphate's collapse. It is working less well now, as the number of powerful parties demanding payment increases faster than Valencia's considerable wealth can comfortably accommodate. The Almoravids make their move in 1092, sending a force north that threatens Valencia's southern approaches with the kind of military seriousness that cannot be managed through tribute payments and diplomatic letters. Al-Qadir, faced with this pressure from the south and your dominant presence everywhere else, makes the calculation that has been available to him for some time and that he has been postponing with the optimism of a man who keeps hoping the situation will resolve itself without requiring him to make an irreversible choice. He reaches an accommodation with you. The precise terms are documented with the usual medieval imprecision, but the essential structure is clear. Al-Qadir acknowledges your authority over the wider region while retaining nominal governance of Valencia itself under conditions that make your position as the real power behind that governance unmistakably clear to everyone involved. It is not yet the city, not quite, but it is something very close to it, and more importantly, it is stable in a way that the previous arrangements were not. You have created through patience and pressure and the careful management of every variable you could reach a situation in which Valencia's eventual transfer to your direct control has become the path of least resistance rather than the object of violent contest. Here is the detail that illuminates something essential about your character during this period. Contemporary accounts note that you maintained strict discipline within your forces regarding the treatment of Valencia's civilian population and agricultural infrastructure. Soldiers who looted without authorization faced punishment. The irrigation systems that fed the city's hinterland were protected rather than damaged, because you understood, with the economic intelligence that distinguishes genuine strategists from mere fighters, that a Valencia you eventually governed needed to be a Valencia that still functioned. You were not just winning a city, you were preserving an inheritance. The Almoravid force that threatened from the south withdraws without the decisive engagement that would have clarified the military situation one way or another, leaving Valencia in its new ambiguous equilibrium formerly under Alcadir, practically under your influence, watched anxiously by every power in the region. The city breathes. Its markets continue operating. Its population goes about the business of daily life, with the practiced resilience of urban communities that have survived enough political transitions to know that the essential rhythms of commerce and domestic life tend to outlast any particular set of rulers. Inside those walls, in the councils and conversations of Valencia's leading families and administrators, the question being quietly asked is no longer whether the current arrangement will hold indefinitely. Everyone understands it will not. The question being asked is what comes next, and whether what comes next might be managed in ways that preserve the city's wealth and internal organization through the transition. You are asking yourself the same question from the outside, with the focused attention of a man who has been preparing for this moment for years without being entirely certain it would arrive. It is arriving now. You can feel the weight of it in the way the situation has stopped being fluid and started being inevitable. The gates of Valencia are not open yet, but they are no longer quite as firmly closed as they were, and you are a man who has learned from long and costly experience exactly what to do with a door that is almost ready to open. Patience in military strategy is the most underrated weapon in any commander's arsenal. It does not make for exciting chronicle entries. It does not produce the kind of single dramatic moment that poets can build a stanza around. It does not give the men sitting around the campfire at night something vivid to retell. What it produces instead is a grinding, incremental, psychologically exhausting pressure that works on a besieged population the way water works on stone, not through any single dramatic application of force, but through the relentless, unceasing accumulation of small effects that compound, over time, into something the stone cannot resist. You understand this with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has spent years achieving through patience what others attempted and failed to achieve through speed, and the siege of Valencia, that begins taking its formal shape in 1093 is the fullest expression of that understanding. You have yet attempted. The formal siege, the point at which your encirclement of Valencia transitions from strategic positioning into explicit military pressure, begins after Alcadir is assassinated inside the city by a faction of his own court that has decided, with the decisive impatience of people who have been waiting for someone else to solve their problems, to accelerate the political transition themselves. The assassination is the kind of event that looks in retrospect like it should have been predictable, and probably was predictable by anyone paying close attention to Valencia's internal politics, which you have been paying extremely close attention to for years. Alcadir's weakness had been apparent for long enough that the calculation of when his removal would become more advantageous than his continuation had been made by multiple parties simultaneously. The faction that acted first simply moved before the others were ready. The immediate consequence of the assassination is that Valencia loses the nominal governance structure that has been providing the formal justification for your regional authority, such as it was. The city is now in the hands of a leadership that did not emerge from any process you controlled or endorsed, which creates both a problem and an opportunity simultaneously. The problem is that the new leadership, drawn from a coalition of local interests that united around the act of removing Alcadir without necessarily agreeing on much else, has neither the military strength to resist you nor the fiver. Political coherence to negotiate with you effectively. The opportunity is the same thing described from a different angle, a city in political confusion. Without effective military leadership surrounded by your forces is a city that has already lost the siege in every sense that matters strategically. The walls are still standing, the garrison is still armed, but the decision-making capacity that would be required to mount an effective, sustained defense has dissolved in the factional chaos that follows the assassination. You tighten the encirclement. This is the operational moment where the years of patient preparation pay their most tangible dividend, because your control of the surrounding territory is by this point so complete that Valencia cannot receive meaningful outside assistance without first defeating you in open field battle. And no combination of forces currently available in the region is capable of doing that. The Almoravids are the one potential exception, and you are watching their movements with the careful attention of someone who knows that the greatest threat to this operation is not Valencia's garrison but a large, disciplined relief force arriving from the south before the city's resistance collapses. The supply situation inside Valencia begins deteriorating with the mathematical inevitability of a closed system running down. The agricultural hinterland that produces the city's food is under your control. The roads that would bring outside supplies are watched by your forces. The port, which in theory provides an alternative supply route, is effectively neutralized by your ability to control the coastal approaches. Valencia is not starving, yet the city's storehouses are substantial because its administrators have always understood that the city's exposed position makes supply reserves a basic prudential requirement, but the trajectory is clear to everyone inside who is capable of doing arithmetic, which in a city of Valencia's sophistication is most of the people who matter. Historians still argue about the specific hardships Valencia's population endured during this period, and the degree to which Rodrigo deliberately targeted civilian food supplies versus simply accepting civilian suffering as an unavoidable byproduct of cutting military supply lines. The distinction matters morally, and the sources are predictably not helpful in resolving it. What the sources do agree on is that conditions inside the city became genuinely severe over the extended duration of the siege, and that the psychological pressure of watching your food supply diminish with no credible relief in sight is a weapon as effective as any catapult. Here is the detail about the siege that tends to genuinely surprise people encountering it for the first time it lasts, depending on how you count the beginning, somewhere between 19 months and nearly 3 years. This is not a quick storm of walls and ladders. This is a sustained, grinding, logistically complex operation that requires your force to maintain cohesion and effectiveness over an extended period, while managing the restiveness that long sieges always produce in armies that would prefer to be doing something more dynamically rewarding than watching a city not surrender. Keeping men motivated, supplied, disciplined, and tactically sharp during a siege of this duration is a command challenge that does not receive enough attention in the accounts that focus on the dramatic endpoints. You manage it through a combination of continued military activity in the surrounding region, smaller operations that keep your force sharp and generate income that keeps it paid, and the personal authority that by this point is sufficiently established that men stay not because they have no alternatives, but because they have calculated that staying is the correct choice. The loyalty your household has developed over years of shared experience is doing real work during this period, providing the stable core around which the wider force organizes itself. The Almoravid relief attempt, when it comes, is handled with the tactical decisiveness that the longer strategic patience of the siege might have obscured in lesser commanders. A force sent north to relieve Valencia is met-assessed, and either defeated or induced to withdraw without achieving its objective through a combination of military pressure and the geographical advantages your superior knowledge of the terrain provides. The specific details of this engagement are another area where the sources provide incompatible accounts, but the outcome is consistent across all of them. The relief does not reach Valencia, and the city's leadership understands after this failure that the outside cavalry is not coming. The mood inside Valencia shifts in the way that moods inside besieged cities shift when the last realistic hope of external rescue has been extinguished, not immediately to surrender because human psychology resists the admission of hopelessness with considerable stubbornness, but to a kind of grey, heavy resignation that is surrender's waiting room. The markets that are still functioning do so at prices that reflect scarcity rather than abundance. The conversations in the streets and the councils carry the specific weight of people trying to decide how much longer the pride of resistance is worth its material cost. You are watching all of this from outside the walls with the focused attention of someone who has invested years in this moment and has no intention of misreading it. You know from the network of contacts and informants you have maintained inside the city throughout the siege approximately what the mood is. You know approximately how the food situation stands. You know which factions within the city's leadership are moving toward accommodation and which are still arguing for continued resistance with the passionate commitment of people who will not personally suffer most of the consequences of the position they are advocating. You are waiting for the calculation inside those walls to complete itself. You have given it everything it needs to arrive at the correct answer. The answer is taking its time, as answers under this kind of pressure always do, but it is coming. The walls of Valencia are still standing. The gates are still closed. But inside, in the councils and the kitchens and the streets, the city is already surrendering to arithmetic. You can afford to wait a little longer. You have been waiting for years. The gates open in June of 1094, and the moment carries a weight that no single dramatic gesture can adequately contain. There is no thunderclap. There is no divine light breaking through clouds at the precise instant of surrender, though the poets who get hold of this story later will be sorely tempted to add one. What there is, in the practical reality of that morning, is a city that has exhausted its capacity for resistance, and a man outside its walls who has exhausted nothing, who has spent years building toward exactly this moment with the methodical patience of someone who understood from the patience beginning that patience was the weapon his opponents could not match. The gates swing open, and you ride in, and the city that was supposed to be too wealthy, too well defended, too strategically significant for a landless exile to claim becomes in that moment yours. The entry into Valencia is documented with enough consistency across multiple independent sources to be treated as historical rather than legendary in its broad outlines. You ride in with your household force, with the men who have followed you through both exiles and every campaign between them, through the years of Moorish courts and Christian battlefields, and the long, grinding patience of the siege. These are men who bet their futures on you when the bet looked extremely unfavourable, and they are riding into Valencia, knowing that the bet has paid off in ways that none of them could have fully articulated when they made it. The emotional texture of that procession, tired, triumphant, disbelieving in the specific way of people who have wanted something so long that its arrival feels slightly unreal, is something the chronicles gesture toward without quite capturing. What you find inside the walls is a city that is damaged by its siege but not destroyed, which is exactly the outcome your deliberate restraint in targeting civilian infrastructure was designed to produce. The irrigation systems are functioning. The markets depleted are capable of recovery. The administrative structures that kept Valencia operating as a sophisticated urban centre through generations of Taifa rule are intact, staffed by experienced people who understand that cities require management regardless of who is providing the governance. You have won a city, not a ruin, and the distinction is everything. The first decisions you make inside Valencia are as revealing of your character as any battlefield choice. You do not sack the city. In the military culture of the period, a city taken by siege after prolonged resistance was considered fair game, for plunder by the force that captured it. This was not just accepted practice, but something approaching an expected reward for the hardships of siege warfare. Your men have endured 19 months to nearly 3 years of exactly those hardships, and the wealth inside Valencia's walls is real and substantial. You permit controlled distribution of spoils that rewards your force without destroying the city's economic foundations, a distinction that requires the kind of command authority that can translate a commander's strategic vision into the actual behavior of tired, hungry, victorious soldiers who are looking at more portable wealth than most of them have seen in their lives. The Moorish population of Valencia is treated with a pragmatic tolerance that reflects both your years of operating within Islamic culture and your clear-eyed understanding that a city whose population has been terrorized into flight or destitution is a city that cannot pay taxes, cannot staff, its markets cannot maintain the agricultural systems that make it valuable. You are not, by the standards of the 21st century, a model of enlightened governance. The 11th century does not produce those, and it would be absurd to hold it to that standard. But by the standards of medieval siege warfare, your treatment of Valencia's population upon entry is notably restrained, and the restraint is not accidental. Historians still argue about the nature of the governing arrangement Rodrigo established in Valencia and the degree to which it represented genuine multicultural administration versus a pragmatic surface tolerance concealing a more extractive underlying reality. The truth appears to lie somewhere between the romantic version which presents Valencia under Rodrigo as a harmonious interfaith utopia, and the cynical version which dismisses the tolerance as pure instrumentalism. What the evidence suggests is a governing approach that was genuinely more inclusive than the available alternatives, motivated by a combination of principled pragmatism and the practical recognition that Valencia's complexity required complex governance. Here is the extraordinary detail that the epic literature tends to rush past in its eagerness to celebrate the military triumph within months of taking Valencia. Rodrigo has established a functioning administrative court that draws on both the Islamic administrative traditions of the Taifa period and the Castilian feudal governance structures of his own background. He appoints a bishop, Jerome of Perigord, a French cleric, who arrives with the enthusiasm of a man who has found exactly the frontier posting his temperament was designed for to lead Valencia's Christian community. He maintains the existing Islamic, judicial, and administrative structures for the Muslim population. He negotiates the position of the Jewish community with the careful attention of someone who understands that Jewish merchants and administrators are essential connective tissue in Valencia's commercial life. You are building a state. Not the romantic fantasy of a state, not the administrative ideal that exists in governance theory, but the actual messy, compromise-laden, perpetually imperfect thing that real states are. You are making decisions every day that have no clean answer, balancing the expectations of your military household against the needs of the population, managing the tribute and taxation systems that fund your operation without destroying the economic productivity that makes Valencia worth governing, maintaining the military readiness that the Almoravid threat makes continuously necessary, while also establishing the administrative routines that peacetime governance requires. It is harder than the siege. The siege, for all its duration and hardship, had a single objective and a single measure of success. Governance has infinite objectives, and success is never final and never unambiguous. There is always another problem presenting itself at the door of whatever room you have designated as your council chamber, and the problems do not have the decency to arrive one at a time. And yet, you are here. The man who was told to leave Castile with 9 days and nothing has a city. The exile who rode out of Burgos with a small band of loyal knights, and whatever he could scrape together in the time available now, governs one of the most significant urban centres on the Iberian Peninsula. The administrative court that once stripped you of everything is now, and this is the detail, that must produce some private satisfaction, even in a man as disciplined about his emotions as you are compelled to reckon with you as a sovereign, power rather than a managed problem. You sit in Valencia, and the Mediterranean light comes through windows that look out over a city that is yours, and the distance between that morning outside Burgos and this morning is so vast that it barely seems like a single life. But it is. It is exactly one life, and it is still going. The Almoravids are already planning their response to your existence, and the response they are planning is not a diplomatic letter. But for this moment, in this light, in this city, that patience and will and an almost unreasonable refusal to accept the verdict of exile built from nothing, for this moment you simply breathe. Governing Valencia turns out to be in its own way as demanding as conquering it, and considerably less forgiving of the kind of decisive unilateral action that military command makes possible. A siege has a shape. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end that everyone involved can recognize when it arrives. Governance has no such reassuring structure. It is a continuous, shapeless negotiation with reality. that requires you to be simultaneously administrator, judge, diplomat, military commander, economic manager, and the symbolic center of a political order that is still new enough to be fragile in ways you cannot always see until something applies pressure to exactly the wrong point. You are doing all of this in a city of mixed faiths and languages, with a military household whose expectations were formed by years of campaign life rather than the sedentary rhythms of urban administration, while watching the southern horizon for the Almoravid response that everyone in the region knows is coming and nobody knows precisely when. The internal governance challenges present themselves immediately and do not wait politely for you to finish solving the previous one before introducing themselves. The Muslim population of Valencia, the majority of the city sophisticated, commercially active, accustomed to governance under Islamic legal frameworks, must be accommodated within a political structure that is now headed by a Christian lord, without this accommodation becoming either a genuine abandonment of their legal protections, a performance of tolerance so thin that everyone can see through it. The Christian population, a minority but a growing one, as settlers and administrators arrive from the north, attracted by Valencia's opportunities, requires its own institutional framework. The Jewish community, economically essential and politically vulnerable in the way that Jewish communities across medieval Iberia tended to be, requires protection that is active rather than merely theoretical. You manage this through institutional pragmatism that is, by any fair assessment, genuinely impressive. The Islamic Qadi, the judicial officer responsible for applying Islamic law to the Muslim population, continues functioning under your governance. The synagogue continues operating. The newly established Christian diocese under Bishop Jerome develops alongside these existing structures rather than replacing them. It is not a modern pluralist democracy, and describing it in those terms would be the kind of anachronism that makes historians visibly uncomfortable at conferences. But it is a functioning, relatively stable multi-community governance structure in the 11th century, which is a considerably rarer achievement than it might sound. The economic reconstruction of Valencia begins in parallel with the governance construction because the two are inseparable in a city whose wealth depends on trade networks, agricultural productivity, and the commercial confidence that only stable governance can provide. The siege has depleted storehouses and disrupted normal commercial rhythms in ways that require active management rather than passive recovery. You direct resources toward restoring the irrigation infrastructure that your forces protected during the siege precisely because you understood this moment would come. You negotiate the resumption of Mediterranean trade connections that were interrupted during the years of political instability. You establish the predictable tax and tribute arrangements that commercial communities require before they will commit to the long-term investments that generate real prosperity. Historians still argue about the specific tax rates and administrative mechanisms Rodrigo employed in Valencia, partly because the documentary evidence is fragmentary, and partly because the question of how extractive versus developmental his economic governance was carries obvious contemporary resonances that make scholars want to get it right. What the evidence suggests is a system that was designed to sustain the military establishment you needed, while leaving enough in the economy to preserve the commercial vitality that made Valencia worth sustaining in the first place. It is the same proportional logic that governed your military operations applied to economic administration. The Almoravid response arrives in 1094, almost immediately after your entry into the city, and it arrives with the scale and seriousness of an empire that has decided a Christian lord governing Valencia represents an unacceptable statement about the balance of power in the peninsula. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the Almoravid leader whose forces broke Alfonso at Sagrajas 8 years earlier, sends a substantial army north under experienced commanders with instructions to remove you from Valencia and restore Islamic governance to the city. This is not a raiding force. This is a military operation designed to reverse your conquest, and it has the resources of North African imperial power behind it. You meet it with the tactical intelligence that has defined your military career and the specific advantage of fighting on ground you now know intimately after years of operating in the Valencian region. The engagement, or more accurately the series of engagements and maneuvers, that constitute the Almoravid campaign against Valencia in this period demonstrates something that the Almoravid commanders, accustomed to defeating larger Christian forces through superior discipline and numbers, apparently, did not fully anticipate that a smaller force operating with perfect knowledge of the terrain, under a commander of exceptional tactical ability, can neutralize the advantages that size and discipline normally provide. The Almoravids withdraw without taking Valencia. They will come back. This is not a permanent resolution but a temporary one, and everyone involved understands it. The Almoravid Empire has the resources and the strategic patience to attempt this operation multiple times, and the pressure on Valencia from the south will be a permanent feature of your governance rather than a problem you solve once and move past. You are building a city-state that must maintain continuous military readiness, while simultaneously developing the administrative and economic foundations of stable civilian governance. And the tension between these requirements will define the remaining years of your rule. Here is the quietly remarkable detail about your military arrangements. During this period, you develop what amounts to an early warning and rapid response system for Almoravid incursions, using the network of informants and relationships you built during the exile years to provide advance intelligence of enemy movements that gives your smaller force the preparation time that partially compensates for the size differential. It is not sophisticated by later military intelligence standards, but in the context of 11th century Iberian warfare, it represents an organizational capability that most commanders of the period simply did not have. Jimena arrives in Valencia, finally, after the years of separation that began with the first exile and extended through everything that followed. The reunion carries a weight that the chronicles acknowledge without fully exploring the compression of years of absence. The accumulated distance between the life she managed in Castile and the life you built in the East. The adjustment of two people who have both changed substantially to the reality of sharing space again after so long apart. The sources that mention her presence in Valencia describe her as an active participant in the governance of the city, rather than a decorative appendage to your rule, which is consistent with everything the record suggests about her. Character from the beginning. Your daughters are of marriageable age now, and the negotiations around their marriages are conducted with the political intelligence you apply to everything. Alliances that extend your network connections that provide Valencia with additional support structures, arrangements that acknowledge the reality that a city-state without powerful friends is always more vulnerable than its walls alone suggest. The city breathes and trades and argues and prays in multiple languages and faiths simultaneously, as it has for generations, and you sit at its center, managing the endless, unresolvable, absolutely necessary work of keeping it all moving in approximately the right direction. It is not the life you planned when you rode out of Burgos with nothing. It is something considerably stranger and more remarkable than anything you could have planned, and it is unmistakably yours. Something interesting happens to a man of sufficient achievement while he is still alive to witness it. The world begins replacing him with a better version of himself. Not better in the sense of more accurate, quite the opposite, but better in the sense of more useful, more symbolically resonant, more capable of carrying the weight of meaning that the people telling the story need the central figure to bear. You are still governing Valencia, still managing Almoravid incursions, still making the daily administrative decisions that keep a complex multicultural city-state functioning. When the poets and chroniclers of Iberia begin constructing a parallel Rodrigo Díaz, who is simultaneously you and not you, a figure assembled from your actual achievements and the imaginative requirements of an audience that needs its provide. Heroes to be cleaner, more divinely favored, and considerably less morally complicated than the real version. The legend-making process in medieval Iberia is not a single event, but a continuous, distributed, collaborative enterprise involving court poets, monastery scribes, oral performers who work the pilgrimage routes and market gatherings, the various political interests that find a usable Rodrigo Díaz more valuable than an accurate one. Each of these participants brings their own requirements to the project. The monastery scribes want a Rodrigo who is properly pious, whose military success is legible as divine favor rather than exceptional human competence. The court poets want a Rodrigo whose loyalty to Christian Castile is uncomplicated, by the years of Moorish service that the actual historical record makes unavoidable. The oral performers want a Rodrigo whose story has the narrative shape that audiences find satisfying, clear villains, unambiguous heroism, setbacks that are overcome through virtue rather than through the patient, unglamorous accumulation of tape, strategic advantage, the name that is already attaching itself to you in these years, the name that will eventually replace Rodrigo Diaz in the historical memory of both Spain and the wider world comes not from Castilian but from Arabic. Al-Sayyid, the Lord, the Master, rendered in the Romance vernacular of the peninsula as El Cid. Historians still argue about exactly when and how this title entered common usage, and whether it was applied by your Moorish allies and opponents out of genuine respect by Castilian admirers, borrowing the prestige of Arabic honorifics, or by the literary tradition constructing a name that sounded appropriately exotic and authoritative for a figure of your stature. The most likely answer is that all of these processes contributed simultaneously, which is how nicknames that stick tend to work through multiple reinforcing streams of usage rather than a single authoritative source. The title El Campeador, the champion, the one who fights in the open field, you have carried since the early years of Sancho's service. El Cid layers over it and eventually, in the popular imagination, largely replaces it, giving you a name that carries the specific quality of transcending the Christian-Muslim divide that your career has actually inhabited all along. There is an unintentional poetry in this. The man whose life was spent moving between these worlds ends up carrying a name that belongs linguistically to both of them simultaneously. The literary construction of El Cid accelerates after your death, but it begins in your lifetime, and this is the part that the retrospective literary histories tend to gloss over. You are aware at some level of the stories being told about you, because the stories are being told by people in your orbit, court poets attached to your Valencia administration, clergymen who have a professional interest in framing your rule as part of a divinely sanctioned Christian enterprise, Castilian nobles and administrators who find a mythologized Rodrigo politically useful in ways that the complicated, actual man is not. The legend is not being built behind your back. It is being built in part with your implicit or explicit cooperation, because rulers in the 11th century understood that the management of their symbolic image was as important as the management of their military and economic affairs. Here is the genuinely quirky detail that the literary histories tend to skip. Some of the earliest textual traces of the El Cid legend appear not in Castilian Christian sources but in Arabic chronicles written from the perspective of the Taifa courts and Almoravid administrators who dealt with you directly. These sources do not present a sanitized Christian hero. They present something considerably more interesting, a formidable, sometimes infuriating, occasionally admirable military and political operator whose effectiveness they acknowledge even when his impact on their own interests was entirely negative. The Arabic sources are in some respects more useful for understanding the actual Rodrigo Diaz than the Christian literary tradition, precisely because they had no investment in making him a saint. The Poema de Mio Cid, the great Castilian epic that will become the foundational text of Spanish literary tradition, is not written in your lifetime. It appears in the form that survives roughly a century after your death, which is enough time for the historical Rodrigo to have been substantially transformed into the literary El Cid, without anyone involved in the transformation necessarily being aware of how much distance has opened between the original and today, the copy. The poem is a masterwork of medieval vernacular literature by any fair assessment, vivid, emotionally intelligent, structurally sophisticated, capable of making an audience feel the weight of exile and the sweetness of vindication across 1,000 years of distance. It is also, as a historical document, deeply unreliable in ways that the poem itself does not advertise. The literary El Cid is loyal to Alfonso in ways the historical Rodrigo never managed to be for very long. The literary El Cid's motivations are consistently legible, his virtue consistently evident, his ultimate vindication, a matter of moral order reasserting itself rather than the outcome of decades of tactical brilliance and strategic patience, exercised by a man who was considerably more morally complicated than his literary avatar. The villains of the poem, the Infantas of Carrion, who marry El Cid's daughters and then abuse them in the episode that drives the poem's final act, are drawn with a cartoon clarity that serves the narrative requirements of epic rather than the murkier requirements of history. What the poem preserves, despite its embellishments and omissions, is something true about the emotional core of your story, the specific injustice of a man of exceptional ability being discarded by a system that cannot accommodate his excellence, and the specific satisfaction of watching that man refuse to accept the verdict. This is the part of the legend that has made it portable across centuries and cultures, not the medieval Iberian specifics, but the universal shape of the narrative, which is recognizable to anyone who has ever been told that they do not belong somewhere they know they deserve to be. The troubadours working the pilgrimage roads of Iberia are singing about you while you are still alive, which must produce a strange doubling in the mind of the man being sung about. The figure in the songs is already becoming fixed, already acquiring the legendary consistency that real people never have, already shedding the contradictions and complications and moments of doubt that constitute an actual human life in favor of the clean, repeatable, emotionally reliable shape of a hero. You are still here in Valencia, dealing with the contradictions and complications and moments of doubt. The legend is somewhere else, entirely traveling the roads of Iberia at the speed of song, wearing your name and your face, and almost none of your actual complexity. It will outlast you by 1,000 years, possibly more. You, the actual you, have considerably less time remaining than the legend does, though the manner of your eventual departure from this world is going to give the storytellers one final, magnificent, almost certainly embellished gift. You die in Valencia in the summer of 1099, and the manner of your dying is characteristically almost defiantly less dramatic than everything that preceded it. There is no final battlefield. There is no last great tactical masterstroke executed from horseback with the gathered forces of Iberia watching. There is illness, which is the way most people leave the world regardless of how extraordinarily they inhabited it. And there is a city that does not know yet what it is going to do without the man who willed it into existence as an independent power through sheer force of patience and intelligence and an absolute refusal to accept the terms that exile tried to impose on him. You are somewhere in your mid-50s by the reckoning of historians who have done the careful arithmetic of your birth estimates, which is not young by 11th century standards, but is not the age of a man who felt finished either. The illness takes you faster than anyone around you is prepared for, which is perhaps the only thing in your entire adult life that moved faster than your planning anticipated. The immediate practical crisis your death creates is severe. Valencia, without Rodrigo Díaz, is a city-state without its organizing principle, its military deterrent, its administrative intelligence, and the symbolic authority that has been holding its complex internal arrangements in a workable tension for the better part of a decade. The Almoravid threat, which you manage through continuous military readiness and tactical brilliance, does not pause out of respect for your passing. It is, if anything, encouraged by the news of your death, because the Almoravid commanders who have been frustrated by your defense of Valencia for years understand immediately that the strategic situation has just changed in their favor in ways that no amount of institutional momentum can fully compensate for. Jimena takes command of the situation with the composure that the chronicles have been attributing to her since the first exile. And the composure here is not a literary convention but an operational necessity. She manages the governance of Valencia, maintains the military household's cohesion through the shock of your loss, and sends urgent communications to Alfonso VI in Castile requesting military assistance with the directness of a woman who understands that personal grief is a luxury the situation does not currently permit. Alfonso responds, and there is something quietly significant in this response, a tacit acknowledgement of everything your extraordinary career represented by sending forces east to assist with Valencia's defense. It is not enough. The Almoravid pressure in the years immediately following your death proves too great for Valencia to sustain without the military genius that made its defense possible. And in 1102, 3 years after you die, Jimena makes the devastating decision to abandon the city rather than allow it to fall into Almoravid hands as a functioning prize. She removes your body from Valencia and this detail is documented consistently enough to be treated as historical. And the city is burned by some accounts on Alfonso's orders to deny the Almoravids the intact urban infrastructure that would make it immediately useful as a base of operations. Valencia, the city you spent years building from a strategic encirclement into a functioning multicultural state, is abandoned and partially destroyed within 3 years of your death. The grief of that fact viewed across the distance of centuries has a particular weight. You built something real. You built it carefully and intelligently, and with more genuine concern for its population than most medieval conquerors brought to their conquests. And it did not survive you, which is perhaps the most honest statement the historical record makes about the degree to which your achievement rested on your personal presence rather than on institutional foundations strong enough to persist without you. Now, the story that the legend cannot resist telling, the account that appears in enough medieval sources to have clearly been widely circulated, even if its literal truth remains permanently debatable, the story of El Cid's last battle. The account goes as follows. Before Valencia falls in the immediate period after your death, Jimena and your commanders face a significant Almoravid force approaching the city. The decision is made, and historians still argue fiercely about whether this was a genuine historical event, a pious legend constructed to give the hero a suitably extraordinary final scene, or something in between to strap your embalmed body to your horse Babiika in full armor and send it out at the head of a charge against the Almoravid forces. The sight of El Cid apparently riding against them, combined with the psychological shock of a night attack and the military effectiveness of the household force executing the charge, roots the Almoravid army entirely. Your corpse wins the battle that your death was supposed to have made impossible. The story is almost certainly not literally true in its specific details. Embalming technology in 11th century Iberia was not sophisticated enough to produce the kind of preserved body the account requires, and the logistical challenges of the described operation are considerable. Even setting the embalming question aside, what is almost certainly true is that your body was treated with great care after your death, that Babieka was a real horse, whose fame was real enough that later sources record Alfonso VI himself declining to ride him out of respect for your memory, and that some kind of military action occurred in the period between your death and the eventual abandonment of Valencia. Historians still argue about the degree to which the posthumous battle story was constructed deliberately as propaganda to maintain the morale of Valencia's garrison and to project continued strength to the Almoravid forces outside. The walls versus emerging organically from the genuine shock and disbelief of a population and army that could not immediately process the fact of your absence. The two explanations are not mutually exclusive. Propaganda works best when it resonates with genuine feeling and the feeling of your household for the man they had followed, through 2 exiles and decades of continuous campaigning, was genuine enough to make even an implausible story emotionally credible. What the posthumous battle story does, regardless of its literal truth, is complete the legend in exactly the way that legends require completion. It answers the question that your death poses: what happens to exceptional people when they die? With the most satisfying answer available, they keep winning. The body on the horse is an image that says, in purely visual terms, that death is not sufficient to contain what El Cid was, that the force of will and military genius, an absolute refusal to accept defeat that characterized your living career, persists somehow beyond the moment of biological ending. It is not true. But it is not nothing either. The stories we tell about our greatest figures are always partly about the figures and partly about our own need to believe that excellence of a sufficient order becomes somehow permanent. Your actual legacy, the administrative structures you built, the military methods you pioneered, the demonstration that a man stripped of everything could rebuild himself into something the history books would argue about for a millennium, is real and substantial, and does not require the embellishment of a corpse on horseback to be remarkable. But the corpse on horseback is a better story, and you of all people understood the value of a better story. Your body is carried back to Castile, eventually interred at the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña, the same monastery where Jimena and your children waited out the first exile, where you said the farewell that nobody knew would last as long as it did. The circle closes there quietly and without ceremony adequate to what it contains. The legend, meanwhile, is just getting started. What a banished man leaves behind depends entirely on what the banishment failed to take from him. Alfonso's decree that autumn morning outside Burgos in 1074 was designed to erase Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar from the political landscape of Castile, with the administrative thoroughness of a kingdom that understood how to make people disappear. It took his land, it took his income, it took his legal standing and his social position, and the network of feudal relationships that constituted a nobleman's existence in the 11th century. What it could not take, what no decree in any century has ever successfully confiscated from a person of sufficient interior resource, was the accumulation of everything he had learned, everything he had built inside himself through years of watching and practicing and thinking more carefully than the people around him about what military command and political intelligence and patient strategy actually required. That is the first thing the legacy of El Cid insists on across 1,000 years of distance, that the essential self is not among the things that external authority can permanently remove. This sounds like the kind of inspirational sentiment that gets printed on motivational posters and promptly ignored, and it would be, except that the historical record of Rodrigo Díaz makes it something considerably more specific and more demanding than a slogan. The lesson his life teaches is not the comfortable one, that talent always wins in the end. It is the harder one, that talent combined with patience, combined with an absolutely unflinching willingness to start from nothing and build again and again. And again, that combination produces outcomes that pure talent or pure luck or pure institutional support cannot reliably replicate. The immediate legacy is military. The methods Rodrigo employed across his career, the integration of intelligence gathering into operational planning, the use of terrain knowledge as a force multiplier, the patient strategic encirclement that substituted time and psychological pressure for the costly frontal assaults that wasted lives and resources, influenced the military thinking of the Iberian kingdoms in ways that are difficult to trace precisely, but that the subsequent history of Reconquista warfare reflects clearly enough. Commanders who came after him operated in a landscape that his career had partially shaped, both in terms of the practical knowledge of how to fight in the complex multi-faith environment of the peninsula, and in terms of a psychological template of what an exceptional Iberian military commander could accomplish against apparently impossible odds. The political legacy is more complicated and more interesting. Valencia did not survive him, as we have already noted, and this fact sits uncomfortably against the triumphant narrative that the legend prefers. But the demonstration that Valencia represented that a city of mixed faiths and languages could be governed with sufficient pragmatism and intelligence to function as a stable, productive, commercially vibrant community was not erased by the city's eventual abandonment. It entered the broader conversation about what governance in a complex, pluralistic society could look like, a conversation that the Iberian Peninsula would continue having in various registers and with various degrees of success and failure for centuries afterward. The literary legacy is the most visible and the most fraught, because the El Cid of literature is a figure who has been conscripted into so many different ideological projects over the centuries that recovering the historical Rodrigo from beneath the accumulated layers of appropriation requires the kind of careful, patient excavation that the man himself might have appreciated as an exercise in strategic persistence. Medieval Castile used him as a symbol of Christian reconquest. Renaissance Spain used him as an emblem of honor and noble virtue. 19th century Spanish nationalism used him as a founding father figure, the original Spaniard, the man whose life prefigured the unity and character of a nation that would not exist in anything like its modern form for another 4 centuries after his death. The 1961 Hollywood film gave him the face of Charlton Heston and an American accent, which tells you something about the way that sufficiently powerful legends eventually shed their specific historical context and become available for whatever symbolic use the present moment requires. Historians still argue about which version of El Cid is most historically defensible, and the argument is productive precisely because no single version is adequate. The real Rodrigo Díaz was a Christian knight who served Muslim rulers. He was a loyal vassal who was exiled twice by the king he served. He was a mercenary who built a personal state. He was a military genius who was also a careful administrator. He was a man of genuine principle who was also capable of the pragmatic ruthlessness that survival in his world required. He was, in other words, a human being of exceptional capability operating in an exceptionally complex world, and the legend's repeated attempts to simplify him into a single legible symbol are simultaneously understandable and inadequate. Here is the quirky footnote that tends to delight people encountering it for the first time. Babiakar, the famous horse that carried the El Cid legend's most dramatic image, the corpse on horseback riding to posthumous victory reportedly, lived for another 2.5 years after Rodrigo's death, cared for at the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña, with the specific attention due to an animal whose fame had become inseparable from his riders. There is something in this detail that resists the easy sentimentality it might seem to invite and instead opens into something more genuinely moving. The people who loved Rodrigo Diaz took care of his horse because the horse was part of what he had been, and taking care of the horse was one of the ways they continued to take care of him after there was nothing else they could do. The monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña, where Rodrigo is interred and where Babieca spent his final years, is the place where the story began its long arc toward legend and the place where the physical remains of the man rest. His tomb has been moved and modified over the centuries, damaged and restored, made into a site of pilgrimage, and then neglected and then rediscovered. The relics of a legend, like the legend itself, require continuous tending to survive the indifference of time. What survives without tending, what needs no monument or tomb or institutional preservation to persist, is the shape of the story itself. A man is told he does not belong. He is stripped of everything that belonging meant in material terms. He goes out into the world with the people loyal enough to follow him, and the skills that no decree can confiscate, and the patience to build, slowly and without guarantee of success, something that eventually cannot be ignored. He builds it not once, but twice, losing and rebuilding with a consistency that transforms exile from a punishment into ultimately a school. He arrives at the end at a city on the eastern coast of Iberia that the world still knows by the name he gave it meaning, and he governs it with more wisdom and more genuine complexity than the legend that replaces him will ever fully capture. The legend says he never lost. The history says he lost repeatedly and built something real anyway, which is the more demanding and the more truthful version of the same essential story. You are lying in your bed somewhere in the world at whatever hour this finds you, and the story of a man exiled from everything he had built and who built it all again, better, stranger, more lasting, has been keeping you company through the dark. His name was Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar. The world called him El Cid, and the world has not stopped calling him that in nearly 1,000 years. That is what exile done wrong by the people imposing it and right by the person surviving it can produce. That is what refusing the verdict looks like across the full length of a life. And now the night does what night does best. It deepens and quiets and begins the slow work of dissolving the edges of things. The walls of Valencia are far away now, growing soft in the distance, their stones losing their sharp outline the way all stones do when the light withdraws and the imagination releases its grip on the details. The Mediterranean sits beyond them, that ancient, restless water that has witnessed so many arrivals and departures that it has long since stopped keeping count, its surface settling in the way that deep water settles when the wind has moved on to trouble somewhere else. The orange groves of the Valencian hinterland breathe in the dark, the irrigation channels, carrying their quiet thread of water through the night with the unhurried continuity of systems designed to outlast any individual's tenure on the land. Rodrigo Diaz has been still for nearly 1,000 years, and the world he moved through so restlessly has stilled around his memory into something quieter and more permanent than anything he planned. The exile is over, the campaigns are done. The siege has lifted and the gates have opened and the governing is finished and the legend has found its shape and the horse has been tended and the tomb has been made and the poem has been written and the films have been produced and the scholars have argued and the pilgrims have visited and the night has come down over all of it with the same gentle indifference it brings to everything. You are here. Your bed is around you. The world outside your window is doing whatever it does at this hour in your particular corner of the planet, and it is asking nothing of you right now except that you rest. The story has ended the only way a good story can end, not with everything resolved, because nothing is ever fully resolved, but with the sense that something real was attempted and something real was achieved, and the attempting and achieving were in the end worth the cost. Let the campeador ride on into the dark. Let the legend travel its roads. Let the scholars argue their necessary arguments in the daylight hours when argument is appropriate. For now, it is enough to have travelled alongside him for a little while, through the exile and the battles and the patience and the city on the coast, and to carry that company with you into the quiet. The lights are low, the world is still. Sleep is very close now, and it is asking for nothing more than your willingness to let the day go. Let it go. You have earned the rest. Sweet dreams.